Welcome back to Everything is a Primary Source, the podcast version of Quantum Leap, going from year to year in history to get a first-person perspective of each era. But instead of leaping into people, like Dr. Sam Beckett, we drop in on pop culture, like movies, TV shows, books, toys, games, and music to learn about the past. Also, I don't have a holograph of a womanizer to guide me around, and as far as I know, these podcasts don't actually alter the course of history. Other than those minor details, that is the podcast in a nutshell. Today's episode is about California, and more specifically what California has long represented in American society and culture. I made my very first visit to the Golden State this past summer and loved every minute of it. As a born and bred Easterner, I've always seen California as a promise of sorts. The promise of a fresh start, a multitude of opportunities that simply don't exist anywhere else, and the promise of perfect weather all year round. Surf guitarist Laramie Dean joins me today to talk about his friend and mentor Dick Dale, who 60 years ago released 2 albums, one of which dubbed him King of the Surf Guitar, and the other, what we're going to dissect, the follow-up, Checkered Flag, which was released in the fall of that same year, 1963. But first, here's my interview with Janice of the SCA. I met up with the California native virtually this past June, while she was attending the Society for Commercial Archaeology's annual conference, a group with which she has long been active. We had a great conversation, which for me resulted in a clearer picture of Southern California's rich history.
It's interesting because I was talking to a friend one day and I said, I had this really, bizarre love of roadside architecture and old diners and neon signs. And I thought I was, weird and alone in that. And she said, oh, I actually belong to an organization that this is exactly what we do. And so I immediately, joined. And then I within a year, I was a board member. And so I've been very involved in the organization ever since.
And you're definitely not alone in that. Those things are just incredible. And I got to say, you live in the perfect part of the country for a lot of those kinds of features. And do you think that's what contributed to your interest in it?
Definitely. I'm someone who is naturally interested in history and ruins. So, a lot of mine goes back all the way to Roman ruins and things like that. But One of the things that happened when I was in high school was that one of my favorite movie theaters, our local movie theater in Manhattan Beach, the Lamar, it was, a classic single theater. It was closed and then turned into the headquarters for Skechers. And, it was really sad. We actually put the Lamar on my senior high school yearbook, on the cover of it because, everyone was just sort of tragically affected by the closing and the razing of the Lamar. And, I thought, well, that's, so sad that, without, in a blink of an eye, this beloved theater that we had could be gone. And so, I think that was one of the first instances where it affected me personally. And, so it really piqued my interest in, this idea of preservation and appreciation for these things.
Do you feel that in Southern California, because everything is newer? I mean, there's not a lot of, a lot of things that are 20th century. Do you feel that overall the culture there might not appreciate the history, even if it doesn't date back 200 years? They might not appreciate history along the same lines that you do.
It's interesting. Actually, the oldest preservation group in the country is the LA Conservancy. So actually the very first preservation group is from LA. And they've done a fabulous job of preserving a lot of the historic downtown LA buildings. And so, despite the fact that it's it doesn't have the history that the East Coast does as far as the length of history. There's a huge appreciation for it. And, there is, there are groups that, when a neon sign is on a business and the business has gone out of business, there are groups who are local groups, who are saying we want to preserve the sign, even though it's for a different business. We still want to preserve the sign either, there at the business or somehow. So there's still a lot of that. And one of the things as, someone who's lived in Southern California and in California, including the coastal California, that's why I know so much about Vina Robles and places and Solvang, is that, we've seen an evolution from a very Western culture, where, you'll see this when you travel there, but, you'll see there's boot barns and there's, places for saddles and things like that, because there's still, especially on the Central Coast where you'll be visiting, it's still very Western there, relatively Western. It's become more, more of a viniculture as it's moved more toward, grape growing and winemaking, but there's still a lot of a Western aspect to it. So a lot of what I, loved and appreciated were things that, like for years, I'm driving up and down US 101, which is the north-south main artery in California. And one of the things that struck me in the 90s and 2000s was this place called the Wagon Wheel, where it had this incredibly classic, huge wagon wheel right in Oxnard, right at 101. And I was like, how can this place still be here? And sure enough, not shortly after that, I saw, because it was among all these, huge box stores, the usual gigantic box stores. And then, you have this little remnant of the Western culture. And so, it unfortunately was ultimately demolished. But, it's those types of things that, are still, I hope we can hang on to, as many of those as possible. And I heard that a local bar has now done a little homage to the wagon wheel, which is nice.
That is good. And maybe I should modify my statement and question earlier, just asking about if people don't really pay as much, because that actually might be more of a East Coast thing, because, we have a longer Anglo history than, so it's almost like when people became aware of history going away, people in the western part of the country, which is newer, might have that much more of a ownership of it and a care for it. Whereas when I'm driving around and I see a little cemetery here in New Hampshire, like a family cemetery that's surrounded on one side by a gas station, the other side by a Taco Bell, that tells me actually maybe people don't care as much around here as they might out there.
It's interesting because, as we're talking about this, one of the things I was thinking about is, there's the evolution of, you can have preservation when you have education, when you have money, when you've met certain elements within your culture, right? And one of the interesting things about the West Coast is that, we've reached that, universally across the United States, but the West Coast has reached that earlier with respect to the age of our buildings. Because, and so we've had this ability to catch things earlier on than, than the East Coast, some of these places where, the buildings have existed for longer. So, as we're talking about that, and, I think that's a fascinating thing is that we've actually been able to save things earlier because we've reached that state in our our countrywide culture, in our countrywide socioeconomic situation, status.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's where I was going with it. It was because when you look at, even just like a political map of the United States reveals that, because the abilities of travel in the times that the eastern states were being formed, into colonies and everything, was limited. By the time the West starts to be populated, you had railroads and eventually automobiles. So the states are gigantic, because to travel from any section of that state to the capital
wouldn't nearly take as long because of modern transportation. So I'm sure that's reflected, like you said, also in just kind of the speed of awareness. There's a great essay that I'm a teacher, and I share with my students an essay called "Born Modern: How the West Came to Be" by Richard White, and he's out of Stanford, so he and that's his focal point is Western United States history. And his thesis basically is that the modern West, the West as we know it, is a product of the Civil War and World War II. And that it's basically the federal government, the eastern part of the country didn't have the federal government to develop it. But 13 of the states predate the federal government, whereas much of the West had the guidance of, I think a good part of Nevada is still owned by yes. Washington, basically. So right. They had the guidance of and sort of the influence of federal power, which grew so much after the Civil War and during the Civil War, and grew so much even more during the 30s and into World War II. So what you're seeing, and he also, I saw him on another clip one time, referring to the West as being far more urban than rural. Than most people. Most people think of the West as, like you said, cowboys and, wide open spaces. That doesn't mean those spaces are actually occupied. Like in order to be rural, you really have to have somebody living there and using the land for, something. Otherwise it's just barren. I did travel a few summers ago. We took a drive, from New Hampshire all the way to the Grand Canyon. And I was really tempted because I'd never been to California before. I saw the sign in Flagstaff. It said Los Angeles, 400 some odd miles away. I'm like, that's one more day. We didn't end up doing it. We turned it back after the Grand Canyon. But I recognized that right away when I was out there. Like as soon as we passed, I would say maybe even as early as the Mississippi River, definitely after we got past Oklahoma, I was recognizing, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty right. Like you can go, in New Mexico and Arizona, dozens of miles, if not more, without seeing anything. And then you're in a city. Mm-hmm. And then you go, another 100 miles and then there's another city. Whereas in the East, it's all just one patchwork of towns and villages that you meander through as you go along. So, okay, great. Because since you are from Southern California, a few years ago, and I just rediscovered it in my stack of stuff in my classroom the other day, I found a scrapbook from a 1939 trip to California that two women made from Haverhill, Massachusetts. And it has everything from their itinerary, their train tickets. They even have some menus from restaurants in San Francisco and LA. I don't know why I overlooked it a few years ago. I just kind of like, because they're doing a bunch of sheet music or something. But I've been looking, they even have a copy of, the observatory in LA's, like magazine.
Griffith Park?
The Observer was the name. Yeah, it's called the Griffith Observer. And there's a complete volume of that in this collection of primary sources. And I'm like, this is so cool. Not only because it's from 1939 and it already kind of smashes some of our perceptions of that era of everybody was suffering from the Depression. Nobody had any money at all because these women went on like a month-long trip across the country, and spend all this time and I assume money over there. But also it really is meaningful to me because I'm like, I'm planning basically the same trip. I'm going to be taking airplanes this time, but I'm like the timing of discovering this and some of the things that, it still has a ticket book from the parlor car that they took from San Francisco through Yosemite all the way down to, LA. So, maybe, at the very least you can read the essay and maybe we'll be in touch when I come to California and you can show me around a little bit.
I would be more than happy to. And while I'm thinking of it, I just recently got have season tickets to the Dodgers. And there's a place in Echo Park right near Dodger Stadium. It's called Frenchie's. And supposedly it is the place where French dip sandwiches were invented around the very early 1900s. And the place is still in business, and it's still hugely popular. It just has an incredibly long line. So
we'll have to check that out. My wife is a big French dip fan, so
perfect. Yeah, excellent.
Well, I love these connections that I make. Whenever I do podcast karaoke, and this is the first one I've ever done virtually, but whenever I do this where people come to me and I talk, I learn so many incredible stories, and you are definitely on that list of really interesting people that I'm so glad I got to talk to.
Likewise, and I'm very happy to give you any advice you'd like, and host you around it when you come out here.
It was really great getting the street-level view of Southern California from someone who calls it home, and I did end up contacting Janice for some sightseeing tips after we arrived in LA this summer. It felt really cool, by the way, to keep saying I'm flying into LA from Boston like I'm some sort of celebrity. But my family and I certainly aren't the first people to ever go Boston to LA. The subject of today's episode, Dick Dale, did that as a teenager, and when he was still Richard Mansour, because his dad's job brought the family to Southern California. 40-some-odd years later, it was Dick Dale who brought today's guest, Laramie Dean, from east to west to play music with him. By that point, Dick Dale had long established himself not only as the king of surf guitar, but one of the biggest influencers on the fastest and heaviest rock music around. Laramie Dean has some new music out and more on the way, and the spirit and sound of Dick Dale is alive and well in Laramie's guitar. He took some time out a few weeks ago to talk about Dick Dale and his Deltones' third studio album, Checkered Flag, which just turned 60. What do you have coming down the pipeline?
Well, the pipeline, the current single is Pipeline.
Perfect.
This was, I know it's a podcast, but I'm holding up a picture disc. This is a picture disc of Pipeline that I did with Dick Dale's son Jimmy on drums. And my longtime bass player, Trevor Luca. He's currently touring he just did Europe with TSOL. He's been in DI for a few years. But he started off with me, both him and Jimmy, when they were 18. They just got out of high school in 2010. And we did a U.S. tour with no practice. They just got advanced. So we got good chemistry. We also recorded with Jimmy Dale and Trevor Miserlou, Dick's classic song.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's the 60th anniversary. So that the version we recorded it came out, I think it was March of '63, Miserlou. So it's the 60th anniversary of that, of all those songs, surf songs. Pipeline came out in '63, and we also recorded Wipeout. And that should be out in a few weeks. We're kind of on the fly here.
Yeah.
Clem Burke did the drums on that, and we're going to use it as Elvis Ramone's first recording, because Elvis Ramone never recorded with the Ramones.
Yeah, he was with them for about a week, right? And then it didn't work out so much, but he's still up there on the pantheon of punk rock and new wave as being the drummer for Blondie. So and that's another fantastic band.
Yeah, it's awesome. He's an awesome pro. I mean, it was so great. He came in between Europe and 2 European tours and Coachella, and he was playing the Greek here in LA. So busy, and he came in and gave us a day in the studio, and it was just amazing. So we're so thankful for that.
So, working with all these artists, and particularly Dick Dale. So we were talking before I hit record that you're in Southern California now. You're originally from the East Coast. You're from Troy, New York, a city I know pretty well. But you came to California to be with Dick Dale, right?
Oh yeah, we had just I had met Dick earlier when I lived in New Hampshire. Before the internet, at least to me, Joe Queer was like, "Hey, Dick's playing up in Portland, Maine." I'm like, "Dick Dale's still alive? You got to be kidding me!" He just seems so old to me. The music, I was when you're a kid. So he's like, "Yeah, we'll take the Queers van up." I'm like, "No way, sick!" So we drove up, and he got us on the guest list. He had done a West Coast tour with Dick, so he became friends with the crew, and he got us in. And I first met Dick then, and I was just blown away. It's so different seeing Dick live than the recordings. It's just, he was a force of nature. His guitar tone, I mean, everything is just amazing. So that kind of blew me away. And then years later, I saw him. We had moved to Florida, and we didn't work out. We had just sold our house, and he was playing on the beach that night. The artist Wyland, he does all those. He actually in Portsmouth, they just tore down that huge wall, I guess, behind the Friendly Toast. The guy that painted that wall, he painted a wall like that in Florida, at Hollywood Beach. And we had just sold our house. I'm like, I'm just like wasn't happy with what I was doing in life. So we sold the house, and I was like, oh, Dick Dale's playing on the beach. I go down, and his crew tells me, hey, Dick's looking for a guy. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. I was thinking about doing a West Coast vacation, So I told my wife that night. I didn't really tell her. I said, hey, I got a job with Dick Dale. I didn't really meet him for a job yet, but I'm like, she's like, you got to be kidding me. So we drove out there, and I get out there, and the guy that told me about the job's like, don't mention my name because we're in a fight right now. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. I have
oh, that's not good. Yeah.
I have no intro to meet Dick, really. So I'm like cold calling his ranch because he is pretty accessible. His phone number was on his website at that time. And I went out there, and he hired me. So it was awesome. It's like I did get the job.
Yeah. And then you couldn't have asked for a better mentor for what you were, your ambitions as far as a musician goes, because he essentially created that form of music that you were playing, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's unquestionably the king of surf guitar, and he's got such a unique approach to the instrument. He's not like a school musician. So same thing. I'm self-taught. I did end up going to school later to learn some theory, but Dick was just totally self-taught and such a unique approach to guitar.
I don't know what your feelings are about the Beach Boys. I do love the Beach Boys in all their iterations. I when we visited California this summer, my wife said, "Oh, wouldn't it be nice, to see the Beach Boys live?" We'd seen them a few times here in the East Coast, and she's like, "But how cool would it be to see the Beach Boys on their home turf?" I'm in California. I'm listening to California music. But when you hear Dick Dale, it's like, so you can hear Dick Dale in the Beach Boys, but you don't hear the Beach Boys in Dick Dale. I don't know what, I guess I'll just put it out there. I'm like, what are your feelings about the Beach Boys? What was Dick's feelings about the Beach Boys?
Well, I really do love the Beach Boys. I mean, you just can't argue with the power of the music. It's, the vocals are awesome. I mean, as a guitar player that can't sing, and I wanted to have an instrumental band. That's kind of because I don't have that gift, And even Dick, he's been back and forth about that in his life in different interviews. There's a lot of different source material. Dick wishes he had a voice. I mean, his big idol was Elvis. Even all through his career, he loved Elvis and even the early country stuff. But he embraced his gift, his style with the guitar. And that became his signature thing. So that's kind of cool because he overcame the obstacle of not having the voice from his mouth, but from his fingers and within to project the music that way. So Dick, his opinion of the Beach Boys, I'll tell you, 2008, he got his cancer came back. So he's got a long history. I've been friends with him a long time. And his cancer came back in 2008. So I was on the East Coast for about a year or two when this happened, and I heard about the cancer, so I flew out to do chemo with him at Loma Linda, like driving back and forth, because at the time he was going through a divorce and there was no family at the ranch. So I said, and Jimmy was too little to drive him around, so I went out and did him the chemo treatments with him, and we did at the same time a trade show called NAMM Show. So it's the third week of January typically every year. So he did cancer treatments in the morning, and then we went to NAMM Show all the way to Anaheim. And the guy is a tank. I mean, he's so strong, you know. So we did that the first couple of days, Thursday and Friday. Saturday, Sunday is still NAMM Show. And all 4 nights, Dick was also getting an award, some sort of presentation from Fender Guitars. He was in a book that had just come out. And so we're staying in the Disneyland Pier Hotel. And all they play in the lobby is Beach Boys music. So every time he walked through the doors, he would wince in pain. It just cracked me up so bad. He couldn't wait to get up to his room and get out of the Beach Boys music, you know. And he always said, I used to pay them $50 to open for me. And there was a little bit of a jealousy there.
Yeah, I could see it because, you know, he seemed to stay very much like true to perfecting that style of music. Right. Where they all but abandoned that surf sound, you know, pretty early into their career. Like by the time they were making, you know, I'd say Pet Sounds, they were pretty far away from, you know, and Carl Wilson never really did that style of guitar playing that Dick was known for.
They tried, like on the first album, they did Miserlou, or I forget, they did Surf. I have to go look at the records. I haven't listened to them in a while, but I mean, they would try and do some Dick Dale type songs, and it's just not the same. Obviously, it's super hard to imitate Dick Dale. A lot of people tried to back then. They couldn't capture his power.
So the way it works is we're going to apply I have a template of questions that one would use in like a museum setting or a school setting to dissect an artifact. We're going to treat Checkered Flag, the 1963 album by Dick Dale and his Deltones, the same way. And I think we've already done a pretty good job talking about his status in society, but I do want to talk just a little bit more about him as a person and his background. And I'm curious if that contributed to the material that the album is made from and his music in general is made from. So he is the founder of surf sound, but he's from the Boston, Massachusetts area. And so he came to California later on. Do you think any of that East Coast, you know, kind of grittiness of, you know, that area is embedded into the style of guitar playing that Dick Dale made famous?
I mean, if you saw early pictures of him when he came out here, he was still kind of gritty, like tough. Like there's a toughness to the East Coast, especially the Boston area where he's from. Plus, growing up with immigrant parents and things too, I'm sure, you know, he had a lot of obstacles. Even back then in California, even later on, when you look at the Beach Party movie, and I'm talking later on, that's 8 years after he's been in California. He looks so different than all the California teenagers. One thing, he's like 24, 25, and he's like super dark. He's got an earring. He's just so wild to them. You know, it's such a stark contrast to everybody else. You know,
and that actually
riding a motorcycle. He's, you know, they were like, you know, people were just scared of him. He said when he would drive into like Newport Beach and stuff with that motorcycle, you know.
It's kind of like the Karate Kid, like when he shows up from New Jersey and, you know, everybody's like this, you know, he has dark hair. What a freak, you know, like they. And I really, you know, one of the questions that comes up with this too is the locations associated with it, with wherever the source is made. And, you know, and I have the perception too, like I'm an East Coast guy, as are you. When I went to California for the first time, I pictured everybody being blonde and suntanned and not everybody, but there's a sizable portion of the population that does kind of fit that. And they've been West Coast as long as they can, their whole lives, and it goes back generations. I was talking to a guy actually in Disneyland this last month who was like, well, the farthest east I've ever been is Ohio. And it was mind blowing for me because it's almost like I feel like the progression of the population in this country has always been east to west, kind of like opposite of the weather patterns. It's like, people are always talking about back east, everything back east from the west. But if you've never been to the east and if you have no roots in the east, that's how long some of these families have been in California, where it's like somebody from the east in 1960, 1950s, 1960s looks totally out of place. That says something about how Southern California had developed as a society by that time, that they see this guy as kind of like, whoa, he's like a greaser among a bunch of surfers. Like, it doesn't really, kind of to go hand in hand. So I gotta think that contributed to the sound that he created, that it was like a much more raw, much more fast, because California is more known for laid back and slower pace to it versus the bustling East where everything is, because I always say like the Ramones are New York. Like if you want New York, encapsulated into music form, just listen to the first 4 Ramones albums. It's fast, it's loud, it sounds like machinery, it sounds like, it's not, and if I want to hear California music, I think about the Beach Boys, California Girls, like, hey man, just kind of hanging out. But Dick Dale is like tearing through all those, he's going up and down the 101 in his, motorcycle, to use the local vernacular. So does that make sense to you?
Oh, totally. Yeah. It makes perfect sense.
Do you feel that your own music kind of has that too? Like because you've been in California for about 20 years, but do you feel like you inject some of your East Coast sensibilities into your sound?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, when I first picked up the guitar, it was like the mid '80s, and I would go to music stores, and there was actually some astute music store clerks that said, "Oh, that sounds like surf guitar," and I'd never heard one lick of surf music that I was aware of. And I said, "What are you talking about?" And it was like insulted, because like New York had this like pseudo intellectual teenager feel, like, oh, I'm from New York, I'm listening to John Zorn, like I'm trying to find all this obscure, head music, anti music in a way, but somehow it creeped into how I play, and so it made me search out surf music. But I still feel like the sounds that come out of me I still feel like I'm from Troy, New York, like it's still in my blood.
Like you can't get rid of it, and nor should you try. It's like you are who you are, and it seems like that was true 60 years ago too with Dick Dale, and that he was doing that. So when it comes to how it was made, what was Dick's what was his preferred way of recording? For Checkered Flag, it looks like it was recorded all in 1 month. It didn't take long for them to record the album. Did he have any preferences when it came to recording his music?
He preferred a live setting. So a lot of that for Checkered Flag at that point in Capitol, he was using a lot of the Wrecking Crew actually on the album. So he wanted to use his live guys, but Capitol said, no, you're going to use these studio musicians. So that always kind of irritated him, honestly. But at the time, so King of the Surf Guitar was Capitol. That was the Wrecking Crew. Same thing with this record. He got to know like Earl Palmer, the drummer, the famous jazz drummer. So like The Wedge is like one of my favorite all-time Dick Dale songs. That's an original composition. And that to me shows like his peak songwriting ability for me. Just totally rips on guitar. The drums are insane. They're like mimicking Dick. Like Dick inspired the drummers to go that extra level, the tempo. Just it's an amazing song, The Wedge. It's probably one of my favorites. But yeah, you can hear Dick's songwriting. You can tell when you listen to the whole album, oh, this is what Capitol wants, a vocal song, right? They want a vocal song. Dick didn't feel comfortable singing. He didn't. those weren't his choices. When you saw him live, it was almost all instrumental.
Right.
So you can see the album, you see the Capitol Records producers influence, but also his dad was a key for him too. His dad is listed as producer on that record, so his dad helped him keep his true self too.
That's really good. And you bring up the Wrecking Crew. For those of you listening are not really sure, it was Capitol Records, or was it just the studio's house band, basically, right? And they are probably one of the most influential group of musicians in rock and roll history, because they were the studio musicians for countless records in the 60s, that some of and added their own little touches. Like I always think about the Sonny and Cher, The Beat Goes On, where the bassist, it's not Carole King, I think is her name, or Kane, one of them. Yeah. She was reading the music, and originally it was just, a regular bass, kind of walking the bass kind of thing. But she added the doom, 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 doom in between, and the beat goes on. And it's like, that song wouldn't be that song without the bass line. And she just injected her own musical talents and knowledge in there. And it seems like that was working with a big company like Capitol. He probably wasn't going to win an argument with them of like, no, I want to play basically like my live band in the studio and hit record. They're like, no, you're going to get these pros. But they were such music professionals that they were listening to the artists they were working with, and they learned from them just as much as they helped record their music. And I'm sure that they carried on what they worked with Dick Dale onto other albums that they did later on in the 60s, just kind of picking it up as they went. Why do you think
of like Dick's approach, like I said, is so fast, the tempo is so fast.
Yeah.
And jazz guys can do that, but they don't hit as hard normally. You can tell, like for instance, The Wedge, like Dick is like driving that song so hard. And it's, when you look at that, the time frame that it's recorded in, it's just an incredible, it's like, to me, it's like the crown jewel of the record is that song. It's just the power and Dick's unique style, and it's pushing the musicians to catch up with Dick.
So he was putting out albums pretty one right after the other in that time period, which is not that unique for the early 1960s. When you make records, it's a little bit longer process, right? Like in the modern era, because it's not as, there's a lot more production involved, not only in the studio, but also with, producing the physical record or CD or however it's coming out. It seems to be a little more stagnated now, where like a record company will say, we want, one album, and then we'll market around that for a while. Whereas it looks like in the, from his previous album, there was one earlier that year, and then he had another one come September. Right. Do you think it was just Capitol, I hate using it, but capitalizing on the popularity of that kind of music, of surf music?
Yeah, they pushed that stuff out as, when Dick signed that contract, they picked up Surfer's Choice. They distributed that. They wanted to start pumping that material out. His music was pretty fickle. Like the taste changed quite a bit. So they wanted to get, I think Dick had a 4-album deal. So they wanted to get all his records out basically as soon as they could.
What do you think contributed to the fickleness of, the tastes in music? Was it because rock and roll was still so early on, it was changing shape all the time, that you think the teenage fans in particular were like, they get bored with it?
Yeah, I think society was like that too. Remember, you got the hula hoop. Oh, we got a new trend every month, and it was different because there was like, just a couple of TV stations, 1 or 2 radio stations. So all the teens did the same thing. Everybody followed suit, like whatever changed popular culture. So they're like, oh, we got to get this surfing music out, So, and the Beach Boys had huge success with the vocal version of it. So, Dick had to try and compete with that. And then obviously the Beatles came and destroyed everything.
Right. They're watching and waiting for their moment, and then they pounced and changed the face of rock and roll forever. I got to think that the reason why the follow up to the surf album, the surf guitar one is Checkered Flag. Is it's like, well, the other one came out in the spring, so everyone's getting ready for summer, and for a good part of the country, going to the beach and having a soundtrack to go to the beach. We can enjoy it in June, July, and August, but then when September rolls around, yeah, you guys in Southern California, you get to have an endless summer, to borrow another Beach Boys song album.
Right.
But the rest of the country is going back to getting ready for the fall and the winter and not being at the beach all the time. So, I'm sure the sensibilities were, okay, let's not keep churning out songs about surfing and songs about the beach. It can be the style. But by doing so, it seems like they added another theme for surf music. So you have some car songs or things that are related to that too, right? And it kind of sets the tempo for driving around and cruising and stuff.
But I got my I still have my 1950 Oldsmobile that I bought in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1997.
Perfect.
I'm the second owner. We drove it out here. It's not a trailer queen. It's a daily driver car,
Yeah.
But yeah, I started because I felt like I missed the third wave of surf in the 90s. So one of my favorite surf bands. I thought I'd catch on with the hot riding thing. So that's what my theme was really in the 90s, was the cars. Because again, we're from Portsmouth and
right,
it's rooted there. And I was going with the car theme. And when you mentioned the surfing and then the cars too, it's all those surf bands were getting a little bit older and they were making money from their surf records. So they could now buy custom cars out here, where it was another big piece of the culture too from the 50s.
Yeah.
So then they could invest money. Oh, I'm going to buy a cool car, And the Beach Boys wrote songs about it. And all of a sudden the theme went from surfing. Now we got hot rods.
Right.
And that's a novel. Like you said, it's fickle. Within a year, Dick's doing surf songs. Oh, now I need to do a hot rod album. Within the same year,
Do you think that the quality of Checkered Flag matches up with King of the Surf Guitar? Are they on the same level as far as like you were saying the Wedge is one of your favorites, but as a whole album, are they on the same level as far as this is just as quality surf music, even though it's not necessarily about surfing?
No, yeah, I think those same. They have a couple of strong instrumentals, Capitol's pushing vocal songs. Actually, when you look at it, like that song "King of the Surf Guitar," they had a vocal song written for Dick to try and promote him and keep pushing him as King of the Surf Guitar. It's kind of a funny song when you think about it. I'm going to sing a song about how I'm the king.
Yeah.
It fits Dick. If you know Dick, it fits his personality pretty well.
Yeah. That's funny. It's you kind of picture some bands will have songs about their band and it kind of works, but other times it seems odd, Elvis never really had a song like I'm the king, it's that wouldn't really make a lot of sense, but it seems like they were in that era, crowning somebody the king of surf guitar was probably, because like you said, people were trend followers. They wanted to identify themselves as following only the best and, keeping up with the Joneses and having their neighborhood, these suburban, which I know Southern California had a lot of suburban sprawl where, houses kind of look the same as each other. And, you're not going to boast about liking something mediocre or, this band that kind of sounds like some, I'm the best and you should listen to the best. And, I'm the authority on this kind of stuff. But I think he has the catalog of music to back it up. It's not like anybody's going to. Now, a lot of people, and myself included, were first exposed to Dick Dale by way of Pulp Fiction, with Miserlou being included as not only in the soundtrack, but the main song over the opening credits. So a lot of, I think, kind of retrospect with that kind of music. Attaching it, and there, like you said, there was a revival of surf music in the 90s. Once again, and strangely, out of places like Toronto had some surf bands and stuff like that. So it wasn't necessarily you had to see the Pacific Ocean in order to be a surf musician. It was the style was established in the 60s and then just kind of picked up from that point on. So the intended audience, I think we've touched on this a little bit, but and as a musician yourself, maybe you can speak to this. When you are writing and then recording music, obviously, like when you're playing live, that's your audience. That's who you're playing to. But when you're recording and you're making your music for an album, who do you usually have on your mind that this is for? Like, who do you want listening to it? Obviously, everybody, but is there a particular group of people that you tend to have on the forefront of your mind?
Really, I kind of just write what I enjoy playing, what I've learned, what I've loved over the years, what I suck in, like my entertainment. Like I love old comedies, I like old science fiction, things like that. The surf movies, those are inspiring to me still. I like the funniness of them, I guess. I think about, most of my life, I haven't put out a lot of music. I mostly have just done a live show. I got into playing live in New Hampshire, and same thing when I moved to Florida. And then when I came out to live with Dick, I wanted to learn how to tour. Like I've been up and down the East Coast a few times, but my when I'm writing now it's different because the pandemic really changed my mindset from being just a live show and having a few original songs to now I want to put music out. So it's funny that you mentioned that the process, like I have a producer. He hired Dick to do the music for Space Mountain. His name is Eddie Sato. So he worked at Disney as an Imagineer for 10 plus years, and he still freelances. He's just an awesome artist. He did the artwork for Pipeline, for Gidget's Brain, that came out 2 years ago during the pandemic. So he's helped me more to focus on the theme of the song and, like you said, the audience. So we're looking for, we're just looking to make the best music that we can. And hopefully people like it and buy it and support it. And right now, like the two songs that we're focused on, the three songs are other people's songs, like Miserloo and Pipeline and Wipeout. But it's because we're paying tribute to the history of these songs, of this genre, because I feel like it's an overlooked genre because people just think they don't take it seriously. And Dick took his music very seriously. Like, I think Dick in particular, the way he played guitar was a very serious animal. He used his equipment, his tone. Like people have always described him, and I'm not the only one. Everyone always says like a force of nature. Like seeing Dick live was surf guitar because it was like so powerful. Like you just felt it vibrate.
I gotta think that is. I guess when we put it all together and then take it back apart again, it's like the audience for your music, and I know there's other groups that I don't know if you've heard of the Surfragettes. They're out of Canada, and they not only play the music, but they have like the full 60s get up with the the tall boots and the short skirts and everything, and the beehive hairdos and all that. It's like you're kind of like putting it out there, like you said, like serious. Like this is not just music that's in the background in a goofy movie or, in a commercial for something to do with California. It's like, it's good music. It takes a lot of talent to do it. We're looking for people that have that appreciation. It's like music lovers will love this music. If you're casual, not really into pop music or anything, or you don't like oldies or any, then it's probably not for you. Like if you enjoy it, fantastic. But this is more for the not quite music snob, but just like the music aficionado, somebody who like really cares about. And that's what I've always gone back to that with the punk scene too. Is like, people write off a lot of punk music as being, because it's, usually kind of crude, not vocally necessarily, but just like, and it's raw. It doesn't have, the overproduced sound to it. But when you break it down to its essentials, it's the fun side of rock and roll that's been brought back. As I love Green Day, like they pulled us out of that grunge, pit that we were in, just like, and there was like, oh, here's an upbeat drums, beat once again. And like, even if their songs weren't happy, it was like they had, energy to them. It's like they woke you up a little bit. It was like drinking
Mm-hmm.
coffee or something.
Mm-hmm.
Where, you know, and so I feel like that it's like that audience will always kind of be hovering around, and I'll put myself in that audience when I hear something. Like when I saw you at you know, playing opening for the Queers a couple years ago, I'm like, that is music that I like. You know, that's like, it hits all the, like a quick checklist comes up. I'm like, is it authentic? Does it have like parts of the past in it? Do they have, you know, is it fun? Is it danceable? Check. Okay, I like it. You know, I'm down with it. And it's not goofy. It's not trying to be you know, like a parody or something like that, because I'm not big on that. It's authentic, it's real. And that's what Dick was all about too, right? Like he was probably a most genuine musician you could find.
Absolutely, yeah. He kept the same equipment from the 60s. I mean, the serial number, one of his heads was 00048. So his story was, I bought the first 47 Showman amplifier, so we got the 48th one right. And I'm like, it's so amazing that he still has that head. And like every time I'd be picking it up, I'm like, I cannot believe. I'm like, I used to keep his guitar when I lived on his ranch. My wife and he got us a trailer to live in that because he didn't want our cats in his house. I'm like, this is a guy that had like lions, right? I don't know if you know how much about this history, but he actually had like at one time 40 different cats. His Balboa mansion at the
That kind of fits perfectly, actually.
He had he had like 9 lions in that mansion alone. So when I moved, he invited us to live there. We were going to stay in the guest room, and he's like, "You brought cats? We can't have cats in here." The dog's looking upset. I'm like, "Oh, brother." So then he got us a trailer to live in on the ranch. But I used to keep his guitar with me in the trailer. I'm like, I got to hold the beast every day for like a year, just living on the ranch. You know, it's just an awesome presenter. You know, when he hit the stage, I just love that about him.
That goes so far, especially in a time period that we're discussing here with the early 1960s, when pop music was still trying to find its way. You know, people were trying to, and rock and roll in particular, was really trying to find, like, I don't know if you remember from school, if you ever had a history class that had the huge timeline. It was like the world history timeline across like the wall. I have one of my own, and it probably came from like the 40s or the 50s. I have one in my own classroom. And it starts, it's like all of human history, and it's a big, like, hand-drawn timeline. And it's like from, you know, the earliest days, it's just like one big line. It looks like a giant snake, but then by the time as time goes on, it branches off into all these different directions. And then by the time you're in, you know, the modern era, it's like so many different like tentacles going every direction. Right. And, you know, rock and roll has turned that way for sure. Like I was just earlier today recording an episode about an album from 10 years later, Piano Man by Billy Joel. And it's like, by that point, rock and roll had really graduated. There was lots of different variations of it and different sounds and other forms of music, and, you know, showing up in there. But in 1963, it's still pretty. It's not quite as diced up. There's maybe like 4 or 5 different genres, and it looks like, you know, and Dick Dale and other surf, you know, they're carving out surf guitar and surf music as another subgenre of rock and roll. He's also given credit, and I don't know how much you feel about this strongly, of being the father of heavy metal. That some people call him that. Do you give that credibility, that reference of heavy metal guitar being started with Dick Dale?
Oh, totally. that style of picking, when you listen to the way he plays guitar, and then you graduate, like you said, to the Jimi Hendrix era with the distorted guitar, you know, you can see that mixing those two, graduating. I think of that especially on the West Coast heavy metal scene. I think of all the metal bands and the way their speed picking and developed was totally from Dick Dale. Dick Dale brought that speed picking in, and then they just brought in the saturation and distortion on the guitar amps, you know.
Yeah, and you got yourself, you know, it's so, you know, and it's like you see, you know, it's kind of like how Motorhead is one of those bands that people from various different, you know, if you're into punk rock, if you're into heavy metal, if you're into thrash, if you're into, you know, everybody gravitates back towards Motorhead. They're like, yeah, we all love them. You know, it seems like that Dick Dale kind of has that same status among other kinds of music too, that they're like, yeah, this guy's, you know, because back in 1963, even if he did do that with his guitar, like, you know, distort it and have, you know, like fire from the stage, and, you know, it would get him arrested pretty quickly, probably. But 20 years later, it's the norm, you know? So it's like, you know, it's just fun to see somebody from that era being given credit for, you know, music that became, you know, so fixed to a different time period, because it seems so innocent by comparison. You know, when it comes to that. So
right behind King Diamond every night, and every night the sound guy was like, "Man, you guys are louder than King Diamond."
Yeah,
it would be so funny to me. I mean, every night I'm like, I know.
But that's
you say I can't hear you. What? My wife said, "You've got to get earplugs."
But I think that could only come from like the perfect like mashup that we were talking about. Like, you know, maybe if Dick Dale had grown up his entire life in Southern California, it wouldn't have come out that way. But because he had that upbringing that he did and where he lived, and what was it that brought him out west? Was it the same dream everybody else has and that wants to break out in show business of Hollywood's the place to go, Southern California is where you got to go to make it? Or was there another reason that he went?
He was a machinist and he worked for Hughes Aircraft, so they came out when Dick was a senior. And actually his dad was really the one that pushed him in that. Dick didn't have that show business bug, but his dad really pushed him into it. So having his dad really saved him from a lot of mistakes that all the other young musicians had, because his dad was you know, they control all the masters. So even when they were at Capitol, for instance, Dick retained control of all of his music. So when he left Capitol, his dad actually kept in the paperwork, kept an office at Capitol Tower Records through the 70s. So even when Dick was gone, he had his own office at Capitol still. Like, his dad was really into the music business side of things. Mm-hmm. So he saved Dick a lot of headache and worry later, because his whole catalog, Dick remained in control of his catalog. So like when Misirlou happened, Dick made money again.
That's, I guess, in another layer of this, it really makes this and all of his music, for that matter, even more documents of the era, because, you know, after World War II in particular, but, you know, I mean, even before World War II for that matter, but definitely after the Second World War with the Cold War, you know, all the aeronautics and all of the airplane and high-tech industries moving to California, where they had all the space for doing testing and they could, you know, all that stuff, transplanted a lot of families across the country. You know, that's the, you know, most people think of Hollywood as being the big draw, but that's really hard to break into. And, you know, there's plenty of other industries that thrive in that part of the country. And on the Pacific Coast, where it's like that only happens because of the role that the United States had moved into after World War II as the global, you know, we have two coasts. We are a global superpower. We need to, you know, defend our allies overseas. We need the arsenal. You know, we can't just do what we've always done and like make our military size and ammunition drop, you know, or even civilian aircraft for that matter. You know, we can't, you know, we're moving, we're getting bigger, and that is going to make people look for jobs all over the country, depending on what they're doing. And as a result, you have Dick Dale show up from, Boston area, Massachusetts to LA. And, it's like a precursor to when, all those punk bands from Boston and LA converged, those hardcore bands in the early 80s. It's a similar kind of thing, because that's the societies that kind of, and their cultures that clash and result in in this case, some really fine sounding music. I guess to segue back to the Checkered Flag album by Dick Dale, though, I'm wondering, what was the reception for this album like nationally? Did you ever get, or from him, when you toured with him and stuff, was he received the same way all over the country, or was it like more pockets of fandom?
Those records did not catch on, so Capitol kind of wanted to get rid of that contract. So, like you said, things are fickle, changing quickly. So he was going through he was putting the records out, but they weren't doing well. He just was a California. Actually, I got this book here, The History of Surf Music, like the discography. Nice. This is the stuff I grew up on, like before the internet. So actually, I got these when I lived in New Hampshire. This is the book Surf and Guitars. It's an awesome book. It went through all the history of every surf band from California, which most of them nobody's ever heard of. And then it's got like this one that it's got like all the Gold Mine and Capitol Records promo material and charts for like Dick's promotion for the Capitol Record era.
Oh, those are great.
It didn't do well commercially for them. So they kind of wanted to get through it and move on to the next phase, because the Beatles happened, what was it, February of 1964? So this record
is around there, yeah. When they came across the ocean.
They were already building, but by the time they hit Ed Sullivan in February of 1964, like everybody, the Ramones, everybody mentions that performance is life-changing on TV. So Dick's career with Capitol was short-lived. They just wanted to I think the last record was a live record. All those Capitol records, people generally were disappointed in at the time.
Mm-hmm. And then he didn't put out he did a couple albums after Checkered Flag, but then it wasn't until, and then, Summer Surf 1964, and then it's almost 30 years before the next. There's footage of Dick's dad, Jim, crying because of the Beatles, because they crushed the California sound. The only one that survived really was some surf bands like the Crossfires became the Turtles. They're like, oh, we got to catch on to this, and they could sing, so they had hits, but for the most part the California surf bands were all gone at that point. They tried to imitate the Beatles, but they couldn't do it. Even the Safaris, like, they had a big hit, but that was it. Dale, where it's like, here is a pioneer, here's somebody who did something totally different from everybody around him, having all, kind of like arriving at that place from his life story up until that point. And then it just going off in all these directions afterwards. So the 1993 album that he did, I have to feel like is partly because of Pulp Fiction.
Oh, yeah.
That Quentin Tarantino bringing Dick Dale music back to everybody by way of including Ms. Lou. And that's, like I said before, like I remember my brother bought the Pulp Fiction soundtrack, and then after buying, because of that tradition I was telling you about before of my my brother and I like learning about bands through liner notes and stuff, he bought a Dick Dale Greatest Hits CD right after that. And we would listen, he would listen to that in his room, and I would listen, I would borrow it sometimes too. And being like, wow, this music is,
it was CDs available, the GMP Crescendo, and then there was the Rhino one. The Rhino one. I like them both now. Like the Rhino one.
I think it was the Rhino one because it had. I'm gonna see if I can find a picture real quick and see if I recognize it.
Suit with the surfboard.
Yeah. And he's like kind of standing up a little bit.
Yeah.
That must be it.
The last Rhino record I bought when Rhino Records opened in Albany, New York, which was so weird when I think about it. Because I'm
all
like,
the places.
I'm like growing up on Music Shack in Troy. World's Records in Central and Albany, and then Rhino Records opens, and I finally get to hear what surf music is for real after like years of hearing about it.
Right.
And they have all the surf music reissues, So I bought Ventures, I bought Link Ray, and I'm like, all right, I'll buy a Dick Dale because this cover looks terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
And I'm like, this record rips. The guitar is amazing.
Yeah.
Like, I love the Ventures and Link Ray, but Dick's just spoke to me right away. The speed. I mean, the pure power, the way he played it. That record was awesome.
You wouldn't get that from that album cover. And honestly, you wouldn't get that from the Checkered Flag album cover either. Like, it's just like his, because in those days they wanted to present a certain image on the cover, and they, it was like all so thematic. Like, well, it's a record about racing cars, so we got to have a guy with oil stains on his face and looking all, and instead of like actually being like letting there was no like graphic design back then for albums. It wasn't like as clever.
Dick worked his heart into like those records, like on the descriptions on the back, like his pool playing, his archery. I think the next record, Mr. Eliminator. And like he really loved archery. He had like a fascination with certain subjects, playing pool. He had Frank Sinatra's pool table at his house. He loved, and he had all these really expensive pool cues. I remember leaning back in the Lazy Boy and I knocked over a bunch of pool cues behind me. He's like,
"Oh God,
be careful, they're for like $10,000 each." I'm like, "Why are they in the living room?"
How would I know that?
Even with the Capitol Records input, Dick always maintained part of his personality because he was such a strong personality. If you ever met him or you see him in interviews, he was really unflinching with his view,
Did he actually surf a lot, or even like was he into hot rods too, or was it?
Oh yeah, so he loved surfing. I mean, again, he got into it after he moved here when he was in high school. Even after, it was really after high school that he got he moved to Newport Beach, and he loved Newport Beach and Lido. And when I was living with him, he had a boat, a yacht down there, you'd call it. And it was just awesome. That was the only time that me and Dick were ever really alone, because it would just be me and him going down to the boat for a week at a time. Mm-hmm. And he would relive those memories of surfing. He brought me to his old house at the Wedge in Balboa on the point there, the Gillette Mansion. That's the only time I ever saw him cry, because he just loved that mansion. He just hated getting this. His second wife, his first wife, the divorce was he lost everything. That's why he went and started working again, because he was retired.
Mm-hmm. And he chose a good time to come back, because his style of music was definitely returning in that era. And I think a lot like what we've already talked about is as far as like, because the early 90s is when the kids of his original audience were old enough to start playing their own music, and what choice do we have but to go to what we've grown up listening to and start making more of that. Like I remember the band I was in high school, the first
song I ever wrote for the group was called Cruisin' the Loop. And it was basically based on American Graffiti. Like I watched that movie. I loved it. Still love it. And was like, I basically wrote a song about, and it kind of had surfy type sound to it, but it was like very much just about, being, car culture and stuff like that. In reality, I was driving around in a minivan around Plattsburgh, New York, going to get IHOP pancakes and stuff. So it was very much like a fantasy, putting myself in the early 60s kind of thing. Sure. But it was still like, that was, it could have only come from the way that pop culture was coming back to us with that kind of imagery and that sound and that, romanticizing of Southern California style, cruising around and you have like a month in the Northeast to do that, by the way, everybody. You can't really, it's like August,
It's happening. It's almost over.
Right.
Labor Day, forget it.
Labor Day ends it, and then you go back to getting ready for winter and something that I'm sure Dick Dale and his family didn't mind getting away from when they moved to Southern California. I could definitely see the appeal, and yourself as well. Laramie, it's been such a fun time talking to you about this record, and I look forward to hearing your music as it comes out. And where can people best find you on the internet or elsewhere?
Well, obviously a lot of people use streaming, so I'm on Spotify. I try and keep that updated. I have my own website, LaramieDean.com. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, so I'm pretty accessible. I can check everything every day.
And I can attest to that because that's how we got in touch with each other.
Yeah, I'm easy to reach. Yeah,
and so all the Instagram and Facebook is just look up Laramie Dean, you'll find it there. Right? So we'll do that. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show, and thanks for joining the EPS podcast, where everything, including Dick Dale and his Deltones' Checkered Flag, the 1963 album, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time. I feel like October of 1963 is the high water mark of the age of optimism and promise for the United States that followed World War II. Within 2 months, John F. Kennedy, the young president who embodied the hope for the 1960s, would be killed. American involvement in Vietnam would escalate soon afterwards, and that war would transform society and culture for years to come. On the pop culture front, Southern California would soon be overshadowed by visitors from even further east than Boston. SoCal had represented the upbeat, sunny feel of the decade, and given the country its movies, TV shows, Disneyland, and soundtrack, courtesy of the Beach Boys and Dick Dale. All of these products of California would lose their spotlight thanks to the Beatles and the subsequent British invasion. Checkered Flag, therefore, is an indispensable last hurrah of an era. Check out the Everything is a Primary Source podcast online by going to everything-history.com. There you'll find links to the show's social media as well as the other offerings besides the podcast. Be sure to like, rate, and share the show wherever you're listening to it now. Only your support can grow the show. Also, be sure to check out surf guitarist Laramie Dean wherever you get your tunes, and visit him at laramiedean.com. I'll talk to you next time on the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.